Hello, my name is Kyle Levy. Here with me today is my father, Jim Levy.
Hi, Kai. Thanks for having me.
It is Saturday, November 21st, 2015. We are in our living room, and we'll be talking about a series of topics involving biblical hermeneutics. So let's get down to business.
Let's do it.
So, on a scale from very good, good, fair, poor, and very poor, how would you rate your knowledge of the Bible?
I would rate my knowledge of the Bible as fair. Right now, I went to Catholic school all my life and learned a lot about the Bible along the way. But I think in my daily living, I don't have a lot of exposure to the Bible and the learnings from back then. So I think over time I've forgotten a lot of the scriptures. But I would say it's fair.
As you may have known, there are several different ways of interpreting Scripture, including fundamentalism, relativism, and the historical critical method. Fundamentalism involves a literal interpretation of Scripture. Relativism involves no criteria for Scripture. And the historical critical method calls into play what a text meant in its original sense to the people who wrote it and the people who were reading it during that time. Keeping those three in mind, how important is the question of method in interpreting Scripture?
I think it's extremely important. I would say that myself, I take more of a relative view in terms of interpretation, but there are others that, for example, in today's world, where you have some of these groups that take a fundamentalist view with a literal interpretation, and they're doing things in the world today that to many would seem inappropriate, and I think it has a lot to do with the way that they're interpreting the Bible and their particular faith. I think a relative view is probably the way that most common Catholics today would like to see the Bible being taught in mainstream in the church and in schools. But I think it's extremely important.
In regard to the book of Genesis, chapters 1 and 2, do you know of any contradictions in the Genesis creation accounts between themselves?
Yes, I think the stories around the order of creation contradict each other. So the first book of Genesis, I think the first book, if I get it right, shows plants and animals and living creatures being created first, and then at the same time Adam and Eve being created second. And in the second book, it's the reverse, where we have humans first and even Adam before Eve, and Eve came last at the end with plants, animals, and other living things in the middle. So it's almost it's a very direct contradiction. It's an opposite of one another.
Do you personally believe that, in the words of Pope John Paul II, that truth cannot contradict truth?
Yes, I believe that. I think that when there's scientific facts that have been discovered and are proven, where that may look to be a contradiction, I think that the scientific data needs to prevail in terms of what is true. And there's lots of examples of that, I think, mostly around the creation of the world. And it's probably one of the most common areas where there's a lot of debate around the true creation, whether God was the literal creator
in 6 days,
right, as an example, or science was really how everything, the universe is, and ultimately man evolved. That's one example. And for me, I think that just from a logical perspective, I think that I look to where there is science that's been accepted and fact-based, and try to use that as the basis for the truth. And then getting back to an example of what we talked about in an earlier question, using the Bible stories as more of a, not a literal but a relative interpretation of things. So the learnings are relative to, the society that we live in today, and not the literal factual interpretation, which many years ago, before science was available to the degree that it is today, was very different. So I think it's important, and yes, I think science is the basis.
So is it safe to say that scientific findings should lead to the reinterpretation of Bible passages that do not parallel what we are finding in science?
Well, yes. I don't know if it means reinterpretation or it means a different understanding, and which I guess would be a reinterpretation in some respects. So yeah, I think that modern day, let's just use Catholicism as the example, needs to be able to accept that there are things that have been proven and needs to alter the way that they're, as a religion, using biblical stories to teach either young Catholics, young children, or even those that have been raised Catholic. I think that there needs to be, let's call it a reinterpretation, to use your word. Okay.
How would you go about interpreting the so-called texts of terror in Scripture? For example, Joshua chapter 6, verse 21, and the first book of Sam, chapter 15, verse 3.
I think that for myself, I would look at it on a relative basis. So going back to the methods of interpretation and using texts of terror, on a relative basis, I would use those as examples of where we're being taught that there could be things that people do that could lead to, and the Bible would support, death as a penalty. I mean, if you really want to be literal about it, then it would clearly state that people and animals and others could be killed for different reasons. But I think on a relative basis, it sets a foundation for the kind of laws that we have that govern our society today, at least in the United States, where if you take someone else's life, then you may be you're accountable, and you may be at risk of losing your own life. And so that's one way to look at the texts of terror as an interpretation, and I look at it on a relative basis.
Lastly, what can faith communities do to better educate members on the Bible?
So I think there's many things today that have not been available years ago, especially when I was growing up, in the terms of communication and media. Examples could include blogs, for example, and where a faith community could subscribe to a certain blog community, and those that are managing the messages and the teaching can do it in such a way that makes it attractive for people to want to listen and learn. I think the church environment of going to a mass on a Sunday, has a certain level of effectiveness, but it's the same style, it's the same environment that's been used forever, and I don't know that it should change. I mean, but there should be a lot more there is a lot more, and there should be a lot more leverage that could supplement that could help broadcast a more broad and more mainstream message. So I think it's a combination of both, altering the messages to be more appealing to the generations that we have today, which are different from generations past. And part of doing that is to leverage different channels of media, like social, like blogs, like the internet, like the web. And I think that would really help, using the Catholic Church as an example, really demonstrate that it's more forward thinking than it had been in the past, and it could help people really, I think, dedicate much more of their time and effort to the religion and make it a bigger part of their lives if we do it in a more mainstream way.
Thank you for your time.
Thanks, Kyle. Good luck.